You know that feeling when someone says something that completely derails your entire day? One comment, one look, one passive-aggressive message, and suddenly the carefully constructed equilibrium of your morning is gone, replaced by a slow, grinding burn of irritation that follows you from room to room, conversation to conversation, hour to hour, until you fall asleep that night still mentally rehearsing the exchange. You have probably had the experience of waking up the following morning and realizing, with something between relief and embarrassment, that the thing that consumed your entire previous day now feels remarkably small, that the fury that seemed so proportionate and so justified in the moment has simply dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the faint residue of wasted energy and a vague wish that you had handled it differently. What if I told you that the dissolution you experienced overnight could have happened in 90 seconds? Here is something that neuroscience has confirmed and that almost nobody is taught. The stress chemicals that create the physical experience of anger, the surge of adrenaline and cortisol that produces the racing heart, the tightened jaw, the heat rising in your chest, the narrowing of your vision, the urgent sense that something must be done right now, have a natural biological lifespan of approximately 90 seconds. From the moment a trigger activates your stress response to the moment those chemicals, if left uninterrupted, would naturally complete their cycle and flush from your bloodstream, 90 seconds. 1.5 minutes, the duration of a short advertisement. This is not a metaphor. It is a physiological fact, documented by neuroanatomist Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor in her research on the brain, confirmed by multiple subsequent studies on the stress response cycle. The body's anger response is designed to be brief, intense, and self-completing. It is an alarm system powerful enough to mobilize your resources in the face of a genuine threat, but also designed to turn itself off once the threat has been assessed and the appropriate response has been mobilized. The body does not want to stay angry. Anger is metabolically expensive. The system is engineered to return to baseline. The reason most of us stay angry for 20 minutes, or 2 hours, or 3 days has nothing to do with the biology. It has everything to do with what we do after the initial 90 seconds. We pick up the story. We replay the triggering moment with the obsessive detail of a film director reviewing a scene. We rehearse the comeback, the perfect, devastatingly precise response that we did not deliver in the moment, but have now refined to a razor's edge in our imagination. We construct the argument, assemble the evidence, build the case for why our anger is entirely justified and the other person is entirely wrong. We run the scenario forward into imagined futures, where they finally understand and apologize, or backward into a history of similar offenses that confirms the pattern we suspected. We make more toast. And as long as we are making more toast, the alarm keeps sounding. The 90-second rule is not a trick or a technique. It is a map of reality, a description of how the anger system actually works, and therefore a description of where your real power lies. Because if the biological anger response completes itself in 90 seconds, and you are still angry 20 minutes later, then every second of that anger beyond the initial 90 is anger you are actively generating through your own mental activity. It is anger you are choosing, whether or not you have been conscious of making that choice. And the moment you understand that, the entire equation of emotional experience begins to shift. You are not the passive recipient of your anger. You are, after that first 90 seconds, its primary producer. Think about someone in your life whose composure you genuinely admire. Someone who navigates situations that would have most people exploding with a consistency and grace that can feel almost supernatural. You have probably assumed, at some level, that this person is simply built differently, that they were issued some combination of temperament and circumstance that you were not. But what is actually happening is far more accessible than that. This person has learned, through conscious practice or through the accumulated wisdom of difficult experience, where their choice point is. They know what 90 seconds feels like from the inside, and they have developed the capacity to use those 90 seconds rather than immediately filling them with the narrative that extends the anger indefinitely. You are going to learn the same thing, and you are going to learn it in 10 specific, practical, deeply grounded steps. Chapter 1. The Button Pusher Myth. You are not a remote control. They really know how to push my buttons. We say this so automatically, so casually, that we have genuinely stopped hearing what we are saying. We speak as if we are passive devices, helpless remote controls, perfectly engineered to respond to inputs we did not choose and cannot prevent, issuing predetermined outputs at the command of anyone who happens to know the right sequence. We speak as if our emotional experience is a direct and automatic function of other people's behavior, with no meaningful agency anywhere in the chain. The button pusher myth is the belief that other people have the power to determine how you feel. It is one of the most pervasive and most costly beliefs in the entire domain of emotional life because it simultaneously makes you helpless and makes other people responsible. If they can push your buttons, then your emotional state is their doing, and the only way to feel better is for them to stop, which means your well-being is perpetually dependent on the behavior of people you cannot control, which means you are, emotionally speaking, always at someone else's mercy. Here is the truth that dismantles this myth at its foundation. Nobody can push buttons that are not already there. The button exists before the pusher arrives. It was not installed by this person. It predates this relationship. It was formed, often much earlier, often in circumstances very different from the current one, by experiences that left impressions deep enough that similar stimuli still activate a response. What the button pusher is doing, when they push your button, is not causing your emotional reaction. They are revealing an emotional reaction that was already available to be triggered. They are showing you where something in you is still sensitive, still unresolved, still carrying enough charge that the right input can activate it. This distinction might seem subtle, but its practical implications are enormous. If someone is pushing your buttons, they are the agent and you are the object, and your primary task is either to change them or to avoid them. But if someone is revealing your buttons, if their behavior is functioning as a diagnostic, pointing precisely at where you still carry unhealed material, then they are providing you with genuinely valuable information. They are showing you where your work is. They are marking the territory where your growth is available. Your coworker makes their characteristic sarcastic comment, the one that reliably produces in you a spike of anger that feels disproportionate, that lingers longer than seems justified, that you find yourself still thinking about hours later. The ordinary response is to focus entirely on the coworker, analyzing their behavior, questioning their motives, rehearsing the conversation in which you finally address the pattern. But the more interesting and more productive question is, why does this specific behavior, from this specific person, activate this specific intensity of response in you? Because the same comment from someone else might produce mild annoyance at most. The charge does not belong entirely to the comment or to the person making it. The charge is yours. It is connected to something. Maybe the sarcasm echoes the voice of a critical parent who used it as a primary tool of dismissal during years when you were dependent on their approval and unable to protect yourself from their contempt. Maybe it activates a deep and long-standing fear of being seen as foolish or incompetent. Maybe it connects to a pattern of not being taken seriously that has been accumulating evidence since childhood. Whatever the specific connection, the button is revealing its own history. And that history, that specific wound or values violation that the trigger is pointing at, is something that can be examined, understood, and worked with in ways that gradually reduce its charge. When you stop being a remote control, you become what you always actually were, the operator of your own emotional state. Nobody else lives inside your nervous system. Nobody else has access to the control room of your inner experience without your implicit permission. Revoking that permission is not a matter of deciding not to feel things. It is a matter of understanding where your feelings are actually coming from, and recognizing that the person in front of you is the occasion for your experience, not its cause. Chapter 2. The Secondary Emotion Revelation. What anger is really hiding. What you call anger is almost never actually anger. Not at its source, not at its core, not in the place where the real experience is happening. Anger is a secondary emotion, which means it is always a response to something else, something that came before it, something that felt too exposed, too raw, too dangerous to show directly. Anger steps in as a kind of emotional substitute, louder, more outward-facing, more armored than whatever is actually present underneath, and it does this so quickly and so automatically that most people genuinely experience the anger as primary and never question what it replaced. Understanding this single fact about the structure of emotional experience will change every difficult conversation you will ever have, because the conversation that addresses the anger, that responds to the aggression or the defensiveness or the explosion, is a conversation that never reaches the actual issue. You can resolve the argument and still leave the wound completely untouched. The argument will simply reassemble itself around a different occasion because the wound is still there, still sensitive, still waiting for an opportunity to be addressed. The anger will keep coming back until the primary emotion underneath it gets the honest, direct attention it has been waiting for. The emotions that anger most commonly protects are three: hurt, fear, and shame. They share a quality that anger completely lacks, which is why anger so reliably substitutes for them. They are all vulnerable. They all expose something tender and real that could, in principle, be judged, dismissed, rejected, or used against you. Hurt says, "You matter to me," and something you did or didn't do reflected that I may not matter to you. Fear says, "There is something I am afraid of losing or not having, and this situation is threatening it." Shame says, "There is something about me that I believe might be fundamentally inadequate, and this situation is pointing at it." These are not comfortable things to acknowledge, let alone express. Anger, by contrast, feels powerful. It feels active. It points outward rather than inward. It does not expose you, it accuses. And so it volunteers, every time, to be the face of an experience that would rather not show its actual face. Your partner forgets your anniversary. The anger that floods in is real and it is immediate, and it carries significant force. But if you are willing to pause long enough to look beneath it honestly, to ask what is actually present under the anger, you will almost certainly find something much more raw and much more real, the hurt of feeling like an afterthought. The fear that you invest more in the relationship than they do. The old recurring, deeply uncomfortable question, do I actually matter to this person? These are the feelings the anger is protecting, and these are the feelings that, if expressed directly, have the power to actually change something. "You never remember anything important to me" is the language of anger. It is accusatory, it is generalized, and it virtually guarantees a defensive response rather than a healing one. The person on the receiving end of that statement is not hearing, "I am hurt and I need reassurance." They are hearing, "You are inadequate, and you have failed me," and they will respond accordingly, with their own defensiveness, their own counterattack, or a withdrawal that leaves both of you feeling worse and no closer to the actual issue. "I felt forgotten, and that really hurt me," is the language of the primary emotion. It is vulnerable, it is specific, and it offers the other person something they can actually work with. It is not an accusation, it is a disclosure. It is the real information about your inner experience rather than the defended version of it. And the person who hears that, who is on the receiving end of genuine vulnerability rather than armored anger, has access to something they cannot access when they are defending against an attack, the actual situation. What happened, what it meant, and what would actually help. Reflecting honestly on your most recent significant anger episode, what was present underneath it? What did the anger protect? What was the hurt or the fear or the shame that it stepped in to prevent from being seen directly? That primary emotion is where the real work is, and addressing it, however difficult that might feel, is the only thing that actually resolves what the anger is pointing at. Chapter 3. The Choice Point Discovery. Your superpower between trigger and response. Between every trigger and every response, there is a space. Most people have no relationship with this space because they have never been shown that it exists. They experience the trigger and the response as essentially a single event. Something happens, and they react with no meaningful gap between the two, no possibility of anything other than the automatic and immediate reaction. But the space is real, and its existence, once you have genuinely experienced it even once, changes your relationship with every triggering situation you will ever face. Viktor Frankl found this space in a Nazi concentration camp. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the extremity of his circumstances makes the universality of the principle undeniable. Frankl was stripped of everything: his freedom, his family, his professional identity, his physical comfort, his control over virtually every aspect of his daily existence. And in the middle of that comprehensive stripping away, he discovered something that his captors, for all their power, could not take from him. In his words, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." He did not discover this principle in a philosophy seminar. He discovered it in the most extreme possible laboratory of human suffering, which means that if it was available there, it is available everywhere. The choice point is the microsecond that exists between the trigger and the reaction, the brief window that opens before the automatic response has fully formed and executed itself. In most people, in most triggered moments, this window is so narrow that it is functionally invisible. The trigger fires and the reaction follows in what feels like a single, uninterrupted motion. But this window can be expanded, not through willpower alone, but through the gradual development of what we might call attentional agility, the practiced capacity to find the pause, to step into it and to act from it, rather than from the reactivity that surrounds it. The question that most reliably opens the choice point is this: what response would I be proud of tomorrow? Not what would feel most satisfying right now. Not what would express most completely the frustration I am currently feeling. Not what would score the most points in the argument that is currently assembling itself in my mind. What would I, after the chemical flush is complete, after the story has settled, after I have had time to see the situation with some perspective, be genuinely proud of having done? This question works because it activates the prefrontal cortex by introducing a time horizon that the reactive limbic brain cannot process. The limbic system operates entirely in the present tense of threat and response. The prefrontal cortex can look forward and ask what this moment will look like from a different vantage point. That shift in processing from the threat-oriented present to the reflective future is the neurological mechanism of the choice point. Someone sends you a passive-aggressive email. Every instinct is to respond immediately and pointedly, to match the passive aggression with a directness that makes it absolutely clear you saw exactly what they were doing and you are not impressed. The impulse is completely understandable and, in a certain narrow frame, deeply satisfying. But before you hit send, the choice point question, what would I be proud of tomorrow? And often, not always, but often, the answer that comes from that question is different from the answer that came from the immediate impulse. Sometimes it is a more measured response. Sometimes it is a direct conversation rather than an escalating email chain. Sometimes it is the recognition that the passive aggression is not actually about you and does not require a response at all. The person whose emotional composure you most admire has not suppressed their reactivity. They have expanded their choice point. They have practiced the pause enough times, in enough genuinely triggering situations, that the pause itself has become automatic, a new default that precedes the old default of immediate reaction. They did not arrive at this composure by being built differently. They practiced their way there, and the same practice is available to you, beginning with your next trigger. Chapter 4, The Observer's Self-Technique. Watching your emotions like weather. Inside every human being, accessible to every human being, there is a dimension of experience that is not the experience itself, but the witnessing of it. Psychologists call it the observing ego. Contemplative traditions across cultures and centuries have named it in dozens of different ways, but they are all pointing at the same thing, the part of you that can watch your own emotional experience rather than simply being your emotional experience. The part that can notice, with genuine calm curiosity, anger is arising in me right now, rather than collapsing entirely into the statement, I am angry, as if the anger were not something passing through you, but something that you simply and completely are. The grammatical difference between I am angry and I notice anger arising is not trivial. It reflects a fundamentally different relationship between the self and the emotional state. I am angry is identity fusion. The emotion and the person are one thing, and anything that touches the emotion therefore touches everything. When you are identical with your anger, any challenge to the anger is a challenge to you, which is why people who are fused with their emotional states become so deeply defensive when those states are questioned. They are not defending a feeling, they are defending themselves. I notice anger arising is identity separation. You remain yourself while the emotion moves through you as a distinct event. The emotion is real, it is present, it carries information, but it is not you. You are the one watching it, which means you are not inside it, which means you retain a quality of freedom in relation to it that the fused person completely lacks. Your teenager delivers the eye roll. Not just any eye roll, the specific one that has been developed and refined over months of practice into a gesture of such comprehensive dismissiveness that it reliably produces in you an immediate and intense response. In the ordinary unexamined reaction, you are inside the irritation before you have consciously registered what triggered it. Something happens in your face and your voice. Something comes out that you did not quite intend. And the conversation, whatever it might have been, becomes about the reaction rather than about anything that actually needed to be addressed. But what if in the moment the eye roll landed, you could activate the observer, not as a technique you are applying with effort, but as a natural movement of awareness, a small step back from the edge of the experience into the position of watching it. I notice irritation arising. There is a tightening in my chest. There is an impulse to say something sharp. I am watching these things rather than being them. From that watching position, something becomes available that was not available from inside the reaction, genuine choice. You can look at the situation with the teenager and ask what is actually needed here, not what would release the pressure of the irritation, but what would actually help. And the answer that comes from the observer is almost always more useful, more aligned with your actual values as a parent, and more likely to produce something other than escalation. The simplest and most research-supported way to develop access to your observer self is through the practice of emotional labeling. When you feel an emotion arising, name it. Specifically, name it from the observer position. Not "I am anxious, but I notice anxiety." Not "I am hurt, but I notice hurt arising." This practice has been shown in neuroimaging studies to reduce the intensity of emotional activation in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, by activating the prefrontal cortex's language and meaning-making functions. The label creates just enough space between you and the feeling to shift your position from inside the experience to alongside it. And that shift in position, however small it might seem, is the foundation of everything else in this video. Chapter 5. The Reframe Revolution. Difficult people as emotional trainers. What if the most challenging, most frustrating, most comprehensively exhausting person in your life, the one whose behavior you have spent the most cumulative mental energy analyzing, complaining about, strategizing around, and trying to change, is actually, in a very specific and very practical sense, the most valuable person in your life? Not despite being difficult, but because of it. Not in spite of the specific ways they get under your skin, but because those specific ways are pointing directly at the specific capacities you most need to develop. This is the reframe that transforms the entire landscape of difficult relationships. Not tolerating difficult people, not managing them at arm's length, not protecting yourself from them, learning from them, using the friction they create as the precise developmental stimulus it is, in the way that a genuine athlete uses resistance training. Not because the friction is pleasant, but because it is functional. A physical trainer's job is not to make your workouts comfortable. If your trainer were designing sessions specifically for your comfort, they would be failing you comprehensively. The discomfort is not a side effect of the training. It is the mechanism. The resistance is the point. Your muscles develop through the process of being challenged beyond their current capacity and recovering from that challenge, a cycle that, repeated consistently over time, produces genuine and lasting strength. And the muscles that feel most uncomfortable to train are, almost without exception, the ones that most need the work. The emotional parallel is precise. The difficult people in your life are training specific emotional muscles that smooth and comfortable relationships simply cannot develop. Your micromanaging boss, who copies 3 people on every email, who checks in before you have had time to do the thing they asked you to do, who seems to have no setting between complete control and profound anxiety. They are training your capacity for equanimity under surveillance pressure. They are developing your ability to do quality work without requiring the ongoing approval of whoever is watching. They are strengthening your tolerance for someone else's anxiety without absorbing it as your own. Every interaction is a set. Every maddening follow-up is another repetition. Your passive-aggressive neighbor, who has elevated indirect communication to an art form and who addresses nothing directly but communicates everything through implication, pointed silence, and carefully calibrated coldness. They are training your boundary-setting skills with a specificity and a consistency that no single workshop could match. They are giving you repeated, real-world practice in the difficult and precise art of naming what is actually happening in an interaction, clearly and without drama, without either escalating the situation or pretending it is not happening. Your critical parent, who has been comparing you to some imagined standard of adequacy for as long as you can remember and always finding you slightly short, they have been, whether or not this was their intention, your longest-running and most intensive emotional trainer. Every quality of resilience you currently possess that was not given to you by comfort and ease was, in some measure, forged in the specific difficulty of that relationship. This does not mean the relationship was good. It does not mean the behavior was acceptable. It means that the experience produced something in you, and that recognizing what it produced changes your relationship with it, from one of pure damage to one of hard-won and genuinely costly development. When you genuinely adopt this framework in a real interaction, when you can ask in the middle of a genuinely provoking encounter, what is this developing in me, rather than why is this person doing this to me, the entire energy of the interaction shifts. You are no longer a victim of difficult behavior. You are a student of your own development. And the difficult person who was previously experienced as an obstacle between you and the life you want becomes someone you can approach with a quality of genuine curiosity that defensive self-protection made impossible. You can ask what they need. You can explore what is driving the behavior. You can respond from something other than pure reactivity, not because you have become endlessly tolerant of mistreatment, but because you are no longer experiencing the behavior as a personal attack. You are experiencing it as information about them, about the dynamic, and most valuably, about where your own growth is currently available. Chapter 6: The Boundary Blueprint. Protecting your peace without building walls. The concept of boundaries has become so pervasive in contemporary psychological and self-help discourse that it risks meaning everything, and therefore nothing. In its most distorted popular usage, it has come to function as a sophisticated-sounding rationale for avoidance, a way of describing the refusal to engage with difficulty as if that refusal were a mark of psychological health. But this is a misunderstanding that the people who most need to develop healthy limits are most likely to be harmed by, because it replaces one problem with another. Instead of having no limits and burning out, you build walls and call them wellness. A genuine boundary is not a wall. It is not a refusal to engage. It is not the elimination of discomfort from your relationships. It is something much more active, much more relational, and much more life-giving than any of these things. The most useful image is not a wall but a cell membrane, the boundary of a living biological cell. A cell membrane is not solid. It is selectively permeable. It actively regulates what passes through it, allowing beneficial things in, keeping harmful things out, and maintaining the integrity of the cell, not through rigid exclusion, but through intelligent, responsive discrimination. The cell membrane does not protect the cell by isolating it. It protects the cell while keeping it in continuous, dynamic relationship with its environment. That is the model for the emotional limit you are trying to develop. Think about the physical boundary of your own skin. It is not aggressive. It does not announce itself. It does not apologize for existing or explain its presence. It simply is, and it quietly, consistently, automatically regulates everything that crosses it. It breathes, it senses, it exchanges, but it is absolutely clear about what crosses it and what does not, and it maintains that clarity without drama, without explanation, without negotiation. That quality of calm, non-apologetic clarity is the essence of a healthy emotional limit. The language you use when communicating your limits matters enormously, in ways that determine whether the limit functions as a membrane or as a wall. I understand you are frustrated right now, and I want to have this conversation, but I am not able to engage productively when voices are raised. Can we take a short break and continue when we are both calmer? This is not a rejection of the person or of the conversation. It specifies the conditions under which genuine conversation is possible. It acknowledges their emotional state while being honest about your own. It offers a constructive path forward rather than simply closing the door. It is assertive, which means it expresses your needs with clarity and respect, rather than aggressive, which would involve expressing your needs in a way that disrespects theirs. Consider the friend who functions as your emotional dumping ground. The calls come almost daily. The conversation is always about the same problems, always about the same person, always cycling through the same territory, without moving in any direction that produces change. You care about this person. You genuinely want to help. But you have noticed, if you are honest, that these conversations are beginning to drain you in ways that are not sustainable. You are beginning each day carrying the emotional residue of the previous evening. Your capacity to show up fully in your own life is being eroded. And the uncomfortable truth is that the quality of your support has already begun to decline. You are going through the motions of listening while some part of you quietly resents the call. A genuine limit in this situation is not the withdrawal of care. It is the restructuring of it into a form that can be genuinely sustained. I love you and I am committed to supporting you through this. I have noticed that our daily conversations have started to feel really heavy, and I think I am not giving you the quality of attention you deserve because I am depleted. What if we set aside 2 specific times each week for a real focused conversation, and on the other days we do things together that fill us both up rather than drain us? This is honest, it is caring, it is sustainable, and it is far more genuinely supportive than the alternative of continuing until you burn out entirely and pull away without explanation, which is what happens in practice when the word no is never available and limits are never set. You cannot pour genuine attention and care from an empty vessel. Protecting your capacity to show up is not selfishness, it is the precondition of everything else. Chapter 7: The Timeout Protocol. Strategic Retreat versus Running Away. There is a difference between running away and strategic retreat that is easy to state and genuinely important to understand, because it is the difference between avoidance, which makes emotional difficulties larger over time, and skillful management, which makes them smaller. Running away is the removal of yourself from a difficult situation because you cannot tolerate the discomfort of it, with no real intention of returning to address what needs to be addressed. It is escape motivated, by the desire to end the discomfort. Strategic retreat is the deliberate, intentional, temporary removal of yourself from a triggering situation for the specific purpose of returning to it more capably than you could if you stayed. The goal is not the avoidance of the conversation. The goal is the improvement of the conversation. The neuroscience here is both clear and practically important to understand, because it removes any sense that taking a time out is weakness, and replaces it with the recognition that it is, in many situations, the single most intelligent available response to a highly activated emotional state. When you are significantly triggered, when the anger or the fear or the overwhelm has crossed a certain threshold that is different for each person but recognizable when you are there, your prefrontal cortex begins to lose its functional authority over your behavior. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain responsible for the capacities that make difficult conversations navigable. The ability to consider multiple perspectives simultaneously, to hear what the other person is actually saying rather than what the triggered interpretation of their words produces, to access empathy, to think beyond the immediate moment to the long-term consequences of your choices, to regulate impulsive responses in favor of considered ones. When the threat response is fully activated, these capacities are compromised. Not metaphorically, the neural architecture is literally less available. The circuits that would allow you to be at your best in that conversation have gone partially offline. You cannot think your way back to prefrontal function by deciding to think more clearly. The hardware is not fully available. What restores it is time, physical distance from the triggering stimulus, and the completion of the physiological stress response cycle, a process that typically takes between 20 minutes and an hour, depending on the individual and the intensity of the activation. A genuine timeout used properly provides exactly this restoration. You return to the conversation after a timeout as a person who can actually hear, actually consider, and actually choose their response. You return as the person you want to be in the conversation, rather than the person the trigger temporarily made you. The language of the timeout is as important as its use, because the language communicates everything about whether this is strategic retreat or avoidance. I need to step away from this conversation right now. I want to give it the quality of attention it deserves, and I am not able to do that at the moment. Can we continue this in 30 minutes? This says, I am not abandoning you or this topic. I am taking it seriously enough to want to have it properly. I am exercising the self-awareness to know the difference between my current capacity and the capacity this conversation requires. Compare this to the alternative, staying in the conversation while fully activated, saying things that cannot be unsaid, and then spending the following 3 days in repair conversations that would have been entirely unnecessary if you had taken 30 minutes to reset. The timeout also functions as a model. When you ask for one, clearly, without drama, with genuine intention to return, you demonstrate to the other person that it is possible to recognize your own activated state and respond to it responsibly, rather than reactively. This is a demonstration of the kind of emotional intelligence that most people have never seen modeled, and its effect on the quality of relationship over time is significant. It says, I care enough about this relationship to protect it from my worst moments, rather than simply expressing those moments and expecting the relationship to absorb them. Chapter 8. The Trigger Map Method. Knowing your emotional landmines. You would not walk through a minefield blindfolded if a map of the field were available. The blindfolded walk might be survivable, but the map is clearly preferable, for the obvious reason that it converts a dangerous randomness into a navigable territory. You can choose your path when you know where the mines are. You can only stumble through them when you do not. Most people navigate the emotional territory of their most important relationships in exactly this blindfolded way, repeatedly encountering the same explosive reactions, repeatedly experiencing the same disproportionate charges, repeatedly finding themselves somewhere they did not intend to go through a route they did not consciously choose. And because they have no map, the pattern feels like fate, rather than mechanism. It feels like something that happens to them, rather than something they are in a very specific and addressable sense, participating in producing. Your emotional triggers are not random. They have origins, they have patterns, they follow a logic that is, once identified, often remarkably consistent and remarkably specific. They are almost always connected to one of three things: past relationships that left unresolved impressions, core values that are being violated in the current situation, or old wounds that never fully healed and that certain present-day stimuli still have the power to reactivate. Understanding which of these is in play in any given trigger, and understanding the specific history behind it, changes your relationship with the reaction from one of bewildered helplessness to one of genuine comprehension. Consider the authority figure trigger, the boss, the official, the person in a position of power, whose impatience or dismissiveness or criticism produces in you a reaction that feels, if you are honest, bigger than the immediate situation justifies. The authority figure is slightly impatient with you in a meeting, and within seconds you are flooded with a combined experience of anger, shame, and defensive urgency that belongs more to a 10-year-old being scolded by a critical parent than to an adult professional receiving ordinary workplace feedback. The authority figure did not cause this. They activated a pattern. The pattern draws its intensity from a history of similar experiences in which being on the receiving end of that kind of dismissal or impatience carried much higher stakes than it does now. When you can see this clearly in the moment, when you can recognize the intensity of what I am feeling belongs mostly to a pattern from my past, rather than to what is actually happening right now, the charge begins to dissipate. Not completely, not immediately, but genuinely. The recognition interrupts the automatic escalation. It inserts the beginning of a perspective that the reactive brain, left to its own devices, never accesses. It creates the beginning of a choice point, where previously there was only reaction. The practical tool for building your trigger map is simple enough to begin tonight. For 1 week, keep a brief journal of your significant emotional reactions. When something triggers you, note 4 things, as specifically as you can. Who was involved, what they specifically said or did, what the intensity of your reaction was on a scale from 1 to 10, and most importantly, what it reminded you of. Where have you felt this before? Who does this person remind you of in some quality of their behavior or their relationship to you? What earlier experience does this situation echo? At the end of the week, look for patterns across your entries. You will almost certainly find them. You will begin to see that the same types of behavior, not just from one person, but from multiple people across different contexts, consistently produce the strongest reactions in you. That sarcasm triggers you reliably in a way that directness does not. That being talked over in a group produces a response in you that other forms of interruption do not. That being praised and then criticized in the same breath activates something that pure criticism does not. These patterns are your map, and a map in this territory is freedom. Chapter 9. Compassionate distance. Caring without carrying. There is a version of caring that is genuinely sustainable over time, and a version that masquerades as caring but is in fact a form of merger, a dissolution of the boundary between your emotional experience and someone else's that feels like empathy but is actually something closer to enmeshment. The sustainable version maintains the distinction between your inner world and theirs. The unsustainable version erases it, and the erosion of that distinction, however loving the impulse behind it, ultimately serves neither you nor the person you are trying to help. Compassionate distance is the capacity to be genuinely, warmly, completely present with someone's pain or struggle without absorbing it into your body as if it were your own pain, your own crisis, your own emergency. It is the capacity to care about someone deeply while maintaining the inner stability that makes your care actually useful, rather than becoming so submerged in their experience that you lose access to the steadiness and clarity that genuine support requires. The lifeguard image is the most illuminating one. When a lifeguard sees a drowning person, they do not respond by jumping into the water without equipment and drowning alongside them. That response, however emotionally understandable, produces 2 drowning people rather than 1. It is not an expression of care, it is a failure of the most basic function a lifeguard exists to perform. The skilled lifeguard responds from a stable position, from the shore, from the rescue boat, with the flotation device and the training that allow them to enter the dangerous situation without being consumed by it. The stability is not a failure of empathy, it is the precondition of effective help. Without it, there is no rescue, there is only shared drowning. Your close friend is in the middle of a devastating life crisis, a bitter divorce, a serious illness, the loss of a career they had built over decades. They need real support. You want to provide it, and you are willing to. But 3 months into the crisis, if the pattern has become one of daily calls, each one drawing you deeper into the full weight of their despair and anger, each one leaving you depleted in ways that are beginning to affect your own life and relationships and work, then something has gone wrong with the support arrangement. The support is no longer sustainable, and support that is not sustainable does not in the end support anyone. Compassionate distance does not reduce the amount of care. It redistributes it into a form that can be genuinely maintained. I love you and I am committed to being here for you through this. I have noticed that I am not showing up at my best in our daily conversations. I think I have been taking on more than I can carry, and it has started to affect the quality of what I can offer you. What if we moved to 2 proper, focused conversations a week and used some of our other time for things that feel genuinely restorative for both of us? This is honest, caring, sustainable, and crucially, more genuinely supportive in the long run than the alternative of continuing until you collapse and withdraw without explanation. The people who are most prone to carrying everyone else's emotions, who habitually absorb the stress and pain and drama of those around them as if it were their own responsibility to hold, are often the people with the deepest genuine capacity for care. That capacity is one of their most valuable qualities. But without the ability to maintain compassionate distance, it becomes their most exhausting vulnerability. Learning to care without carrying is not the diminishment of that capacity. It is its mature, sustainable, genuinely effective expression. Chapter 10. The Story Stopper. Breaking free from the narratives that keep you stuck. You are not, in your most triggered moments, experiencing reality. You are experiencing your story about reality. And while this distinction might initially sound like a philosophical abstraction, it is in practice one of the most immediately applicable insights in this entire video, because once you genuinely understand that what you are responding to emotionally is your interpretation of events, rather than the events themselves, the entire architecture of your emotional experience becomes something you can actually work with. Every time something triggers an emotional reaction in you, your mind performs an operation that is so fast and so automatic that most people experience it as simple perception. It takes the raw material of what just happened, the words that were said, the tone in which they were said, the action that was taken or the action that was withheld, and it instantaneously assembles that raw material into a narrative, a story that assigns meaning to what happened, identifies intention, connects the current event to past experience, and draws conclusions about what it all signifies for you and your relationships and your future. This narrative happens in milliseconds. It feels from the inside exactly like seeing the truth of what occurred. But it is not a perception, it is a construction, and it is influenced invisibly, automatically, powerfully, by everything. Your history with this person, your broader history with similar situations, your current emotional baseline, your fears about yourself, your expectations about how people in this kind of role typically behave, the accumulated evidence you have been unconsciously collecting about this person's attitude toward you. None of this is accessible to you while you are doing it. It happens beneath the level of conscious awareness and presents its conclusion to consciousness as if it were simple fact. Your boss sends you a curt 3-sentence email with feedback on a project. The email is professionally worded. It is specific about what needs to change. It contains no personal language whatsoever. And within seconds before you have even finished reading it, your mind has assembled a full narrative around those 3 sentences. They are losing confidence in you. They regret giving you this project. Your position is less secure than you thought. The brief, business-like tone is evidence of a change in their attitude toward you. The anxiety that floods through you in the next 10 minutes is not a response to the email. It is a response to the story about the email. And that story, however plausible it might feel in the moment, is one interpretation among several that fit the available evidence equally well. Consider the alternative narrative, assembled from exactly the same 3 sentences. Your boss is in the middle of a full and demanding day. They are communicating as efficiently as possible because they have 4 more conversations after this one. The feedback is specific and actionable, which is what good feedback looks like. They could have said nothing, but they chose to help you improve. The directness of the tone signals that they trust you to receive feedback professionally. They gave you the feedback because they believe you can use it, which means they are invested in the success of the project and in your development. This story fits the available evidence just as accurately as the first one, but it produces curiosity and engagement rather than anxiety and defensiveness. It makes you want to address the feedback rather than spiral around it. Same email, different story, completely different emotional experience, and completely different quality of response. When you begin to notice your own storytelling, when you develop enough awareness to catch yourself in the moment of narrative construction, rather than simply receiving the constructed narrative as fact, you discover something that changes your entire relationship with your emotional life. You are the author, not of what happens to you, not of other people's behavior or the conditions life presents, but of the meaning you make of those things. And authorship, even partial authorship, is a form of freedom that perpetual narration without awareness completely forecloses. The practice is to develop the habit of the question, is this the only story that fits what just happened? not in a way that dismisses your reaction or demands false positivity. In a way that genuinely examines whether the threatening interpretation is the most accurate one, or whether other interpretations, ones that produce more useful responses and less unnecessary suffering, are equally or more supported by the actual evidence. Knowledge without practice is, as every honest teacher acknowledges, essentially entertainment. Everything covered across these 10 chapters, the 90-second rule, the button pusher myth, secondary emotions, the choice point, the observer self, the reframe of difficult people, genuine limits, the timeout protocol, the trigger map, compassionate distance, and the story stopper, all of it remains theoretical until it meets the real, specific, personally textured triggering situations of your actual life. Until you are in the middle of a genuine provocation, with the familiar chemical surge already beginning, and you remember, even partially, even imperfectly, that something other than the automatic reaction is available. The path from knowing to doing is not complex. It requires only this: genuine, consistent, patient engagement with a single technique at a time. Not all 10 simultaneously. That is a recipe for paralysis and eventual abandonment. 1. The concept from this video that landed most directly in the territory of your specific patterns and your most difficult relationships. Practice it for a full week, with the honest expectation that you will succeed sometimes and fail sometimes, and that both outcomes are part of the process. By the end of that week, something will have shifted. Not dramatically. Genuine change does not announce itself with fanfare, but you will notice that the trigger that previously fired straight into its automatic reaction now sometimes produces a pause. Brief, imperfect, not yet reliable, but real. You will notice that the pause sometimes produces a question, and you will notice that the question sometimes produces something other than the automatic response. A choice, however small, however partial, that leaves you feeling more like the person you want to be in difficult moments than the person you have been. That experience of being even slightly more proud of how you handled a difficult situation than you would previously have been is not a small thing. It is evidence. It is the direct, personal, undeniable evidence that you are actually changing, that the person you want to be in the moments that most test you is becoming, through practice, the person you actually are. And that evidence is the most powerful motivator for continued practice that exists. The person whose equanimity you have most admired did not begin where they are now. They practiced their way there, one triggered moment at a time. They found the 90 seconds, they expanded the choice point, they developed the observer, they built the map, and at some point along the way, the skills they had been practicing became the people they actually were, not through a single decision or a transformative insight, but through the accumulated weight of thousands of small, consistent, courageous choices to respond rather than react. The same path is available to you. It begins with the next trigger, and the next trigger, in a life lived in genuine relationship with other human beings, is never far away.